Newsweek magazine reported in 2005 that the Holy Quran, the Book of Islam, was being desecrated down in Guantanamo. The report said that interrogators were taking the Holy Quran and flushing it down the toilet. And this Newsweek report led to massive riots around the Muslim world, which even led to some deaths, as some of these nations and countries' law enforcement would try and quell some of these riots that were taking place because it was reported U.S. personnel were desecrating the Quran. But you know what? Newsweek later had to retract that report because they couldn't verify the details or the specifics, not being able to confirm that interrogators were actually flushing the Quran down the toilet. But as the Muslim chaplain down in Guantanamo, who served there on the ground, I can tell you that Newsweek did get it right in some sense, because the Quran was being desecrated in many different ways. Abused, disrespected, whether it was by the guards, who would toss them on the ground after they finished searching them, or whether it was interrogators who did take the Qurans into the interrogation room and maybe stamp on it, sit on it, kick it across the floor. And now there are investigations that are now public online, and when you read them, you find that Qurans in Guantanamo were even urinated on. But that was just one way in which religion was being used. The other way in which religion was being used, or should I say another way in which religion was being used as a weapon, was how the interrogators and the intelligence operation would exploit another aspect of the Muslim faith, the Muslim culture. From when you go to an Islamic country, a conservative Islamic society, what you might find is a separation of the sexes, men and women. In this room here, we see men and women mixed together. But if you were to go to a conservative Islamic country, or even to an Islamic center right here in the United States, you'll find that in a program like this, you might find the women on one side and the men on the other. And this, in our culture, is done out of respect for one another, out of modesty. Well, this aspect of the Muslim culture was exploited by female interrogators. There were several female interrogators in Guantanamo. And I can remember that when the media came to Guantanamo, the commanding general would often say that the female personnel in the intelligence gathering operation was an essential part of the mission, as they were very creative in their approach to gathering intelligence. But what was so creative about women interrogators' approach to gathering intelligence? In an interrogation operation that had an enormous amount of pressure on it, right from the Secretary of Defense himself, to get information from these prisoners. It was very competitive. Competitive between the interrogators who were in the military and competitive between the interrogators who were federal agencies. There was competition between the female interrogators and competition between the male interrogators. But the female interrogators felt they might have had an advantage over their male counterparts. And what was that? Their sexuality. They were very ready, some of them, to go into an interrogation room, strip off their clothes, take off their clothes and stand naked in front of a shackled Muslim male prisoner, thinking that because he comes from an Islamic society, a conservative country, that he would be frustrated and that would help her gain intelligence. They would go further than that. They would inappropriately themselves rub their own bodies, their own private areas, on these shackled Muslim prisoners against their will. Maybe some of them would give these prisoners a free lap dance as that prisoner sat shackled in that chair. But if you look into the investigations into abuses of prisoners in Guantanamo, they also suggest that female interrogators would go as far as grabbing the genitals of some of these Muslim male prisoners in the course of interrogating them. Another way in which religion was being used, which I heard from the prisoners, was the way in which they would utilize a certain symbol in the interrogation room. A prisoner would describe for me on the ground of an interrogation room marked a large circle. And in the center of that circle was another symbol, and that was the symbol of Satan. What's the symbol of Satan? That pentagram symbol that represents Satan. The interrogator would take this Muslim prisoner, knowing that he believes in one God. That's the core belief of Islam, to simply believe in one God. And they would take this Muslim prisoner, put him in the center of that satanic circle, and they would attempt to force him to bow down and to prostrate, like in the form of the Islamic prayer. Maybe when you've seen Muslims pray, we bow down, we prostrate, we put our head to the ground in honor of one God. The interrogators attempted to force these Muslim prisoners to do that in the center of this satanic circle, while he would scream at this prisoner that Satan is your God now. Some of these interrogators would dress up as Catholic priests, and they would come into the interrogation room and they would baptize the Muslim against his will and try and convince him that he's no longer a Muslim because he's just been baptized. And so I would raise concerns about these things. I would question to my chain of command whether or not we were doing the right thing, whether we were violating what's called in the military Army values, or whether we were violating our national values. Certainly in my view we were, as a U.S. citizen, my view as an officer, my view as a Muslim American, we were violating our own values. But those weren't the only things that I would raise concern about. I would question some of the conditions in Guantanamo. Why the facility was one in which the cells were like cages. And many of the prisoners, they would tell me that they felt as if they were being treated like animals. Some of them even pointed out, they said, here in Cuba, where the weather is so hot and humid, and you have us in these open-air cell-like cages, we've seen the guard dogs that are here. Even they have air-conditioned rooms where they're being held. We're being treated worse than dogs. But I would raise concerns about something else in Guantanamo, and that was the ages of some of these prisoners. Well, why would you raise concern about how old one of these prisoners might be? Because some of them were as young as 12 years old. 12-year-old prisoners in Guantanamo. Can you imagine that? Youth. 12-year-old prisoners, 12 to 14-year-old prisoners were held in Guantanamo when I was there. And my chain of command and the detention side of the operation, the lieutenant colonel and the colonel, I believe they actually valued my input. My input actually did give them a better understanding of why their guards in the detention operation could not control the prisoners. Why the prison cell block was always in utter chaos because of what was going on mostly in the interrogation rooms. I would receive 2 official awards down in Guantanamo, signed by the commanding general. I was even submitted for a 3rd higher award, which I was supposed to have received after a full year of duty in Guantanamo. I would receive a stellar officer evaluation report, the best that I had ever received in my entire military career during those 10 months I was in Guantanamo. And then I received something else. It's called R&R in the military. R&R. What's R&R? Rest and relaxation. If you're in the military, deployed for a lengthy period of time, you might be able to get R&R. That means you can go home, come back to the States, see your family. Well, I got R&R after serving 10 months in Guantanamo. Jumped on a plane, which would land at Jacksonville Naval Air Station in Florida. And then I was to catch a plane to Seattle to meet my wife and daughter. But when I got on that plane, what would happen next? When it landed in Florida, I would be met by some people. First, it was customs officials, customs officers, and immigration officers. And I remember, as we landed on the plane, we sat on the flight line. Immigration officers came on the plane and they checked to see everyone's ID. I thought that was routine. Check everyone's ID to make sure people are coming into the right people are coming into the States. But now I look back and realize they were actually looking for someone. They were trying to identify a specific person on that plane. That was me.